From the moment that the US officially involved itself in Southeast Asia in early 1955, following the incremental withdrawal of the French, hawkish policymakers in Washington, D.C. had been hard at work prodding for further US intervention in the warring subcontinent. In turn, by 1964, nearly a decade later, when President Johnson did make the fateful decision to intervene unilaterally in South Vietnam, most Americans over the past 2 decades had been sold on the idea of an inevitable war in Southeast Asia. The Cold War concept of domino theory had been firmly implanted in the American collective imagination. Domino theory famously posited that each state in East Asia represented a metaphorical domino, waiting to fall to the purportedly aggressive advance of the communists, largely spurred by Red China and the Soviet Union. The theory posited that if one domino was to fall, say South Vietnam or Laos, then inevitably every other domino would surely fall afterwards. At the time, and still in establishment histories to this day, this theory holds ground as the definitive silver bullet to understanding the motives for US involvement in Southeast Asia. This, however, has not stopped skeptical researchers from asking the questions that were increasingly on everyone's mind at the time. Was Vietnam truly inevitable? Did the Johnson administration have a good case to put at risk hundreds of thousands of American boys to fight in a conflict halfway across the planet? And was it simply domino theory that pushed the US into a decades-long quagmire in Southeast Asia? In 1972, Professor Peter Dale Scott published his first book with the provocative title of The War Conspiracy: The Secret Road to the Second Indochina War. In this work, Scott outlines his eponymous war conspiracy, which acts as a meta-theory to understanding the real and irrefutable role that private capital, the military-industrial complex, and, most importantly, the intelligence community have on the priming, instigation, and build-up towards the seemingly endless wars undertaken by the United States. In Peter Dale Scott's own words, the war conspiracy is, quote, the sustained resort to collusion and conspiracy, unauthorized provocations, and fraud by US personnel, particularly intelligence personnel, in order to sustain or increase our military commitment in Asia. Of course, in the context of his original 1972 work, he is referring to the Vietnam War. Yet the concept remains universally applicable, especially as in recent years, since the end of the Cold War, the omnipresent communist threat has simply been shuffled out for the new omnipresent global war on terror. The war conspiracy sees a blob of ostensibly independent yet overlapping actors that all have a shared interest for various reasons in seeing the nation in a perpetual state of war. These independent actors are all for the most part members of the American ruling class, and all frequent similar overlapping circles and groupings, as we will see throughout this documentary. Therefore, either consciously or simply by proxy, these actors all coalesce to create the environment necessary to make war a constant necessity and reality. In the case of our current study, this will be the 20-plus year drive towards the Vietnam War. So far, my analysis of the US's involvement in Laos and Vietnam on this channel has been focused mostly on the situation on the ground in Southeast Asia. Taking this micro approach, we can easily lose sight of the big picture developments in domestic US politics that led to the further integration of the security state in the affairs of the faraway Indochina wars. So today, let's take an intermission from the escalating war in Southeast Asia, and specifically Laos, as I am going to attempt to outline Professor Scott's theory of a war conspiracy by taking a more macro-level look at the US political establishment that, over the first 2 decades of the Cold War, created and fostered an ideal environment and social climate that, by 1964, made a war in Vietnam seem inevitable. These forces, intelligence agencies, lobbyists, corporate interests, the military-industrial complex, political operatives, and the corporate media, directly and indirectly collaborated to push the US into the now infamous, decade-long quagmire of the Vietnam War.
Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
The nexus of intelligence agents, business elites, and military figures that paved the way to America's entry into Southeast Asia was broadly organized into several different informal elite groupings, which we will jump between throughout this presentation. The first of these elite circles that we'll be focusing on today, where much of the Asian war hysteria was born, was the decades-old China lobby, which is where our story begins. In US politics, the China lobby, which was made up of influential American and Chinese business interests sympathetic to a pro-Western China, has existed in an unofficial capacity since at least the mid-19th century. According to authors such as James Bradley in his fantastic book The China Mirage, in its early incarnations, the China lobby sought out the mission of turning what was viewed at the time as a backwards China into a westernized and Christianized China, aligned with Occidental values and Western interests. During the mid to late 19th century, there was an ongoing belief that China could somehow be pulled into the Western fold, and much like Japan, reformed by the US and turned into a friendly power, integrated into the Anglo-American sphere. These concepts arose during a time when American businessmen and robber barons were crossing the Pacific and seeking riches in the new frontier of Shanghai and other quasi-colonial coastal cities. These activities usually involved either deeply exploitative manufacturing or textile interests, or, as was the case of future President FDR's maternal ancestors, the Delanos for example, massive investments in the burgeoning opium trade. It is true, Warren Delano, FDR's maternal grandfather, alongside many other American families, made their ancestral fortune largely through the import of Chinese opium into the United States. Importantly, the Delano experience was not unique for the time. American expansionists sought new frontiers for capital investment following the end of Manifest Destiny, as imperialistic appetites remained unquenched. Out of this mold came the China lobby, an unofficial, yet closely linked group of American elites that consistently lobbied for further US intervention and influence in China. Born out of the Trans-Pacific opium trade, from the mid-1800s onwards, the China lobby would remain a permanent fixture of the US establishment. The lobby has had to adapt, though, and the simple yet chauvinistic idea of a Christianized, westernized China has had to shift alongside it. It was not until the late 1930s and early 40s that the China lobby really took shape as a rigid political vehicle, as the interests of the China Yankees were jeopardized by the evolving Chinese Civil War. The US backers of a Western-friendly, open-door China rallied around the notoriously corrupt Kuomintang movement, led by Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang Kai-shek himself had deep ties to the Chinese opium industry, and the Shanghai-based organized crime faction known as the Green Gang. Much like the CIA would do with Corsicans in the south of France 3 decades later, Chiang Kai-shek used Green Gang thugs as enforcers, crushing labor unions in Shanghai during the White Terror of 1927, which saw the massacre of 5,000 to 10,000 Shanghai Union members in a purge of the KMT ranks. During this point, the KMT and the Communist Party of China were in an alliance of convenience, forming a united front against the universally disdained warlords. The KMT's turn towards the Green Gang thugs to undertake the White Terror led to an irreparable fracture between the KMT and the CCP. This fracture of the United Front would indirectly facilitate the Japanese invasion of Manchuria in 1931, as KMT forces left the northern border underdefended, in their continued efforts to root out the roving communists. What is important here, though, is to highlight Chiang Kai-shek's alliance with the Green Gang, and in turn, the melding of the KMT and organized crime interests. The major interest here, of course, being the opium trade, which the Green Gang were significant players in. As the Chinese Civil War would progress, and even as the KMT would be routed to Taiwan in 1949, the party would remain intimately connected to the narcotics trade, working to facilitate and profit from the booming Cold War opium industry. It goes without saying that the American China lobby was deeply sympathetic to the pro-Western, anti-communist Kuomintang of Chiang Kai-shek. In Washington, the nationalist Chinese cause was promoted by one of the KMT's largest sponsors, and a longtime China lobby leader, and purportedly one of the richest men in Asia, one T.V. Soong. Chiang Kai-shek's brother-in-law, T.V. Soong, was the central figure from the KMT represented in the US China lobby in Washington, D.C., working as the Generalissimo's foreign agent and, for a time in the mid-1940s, as the premier of the Republic of China before their exile to Taiwan. In 1940, Soong did what Chinese citizens were not able to do at the time and entered the United States. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was still in effect at the time. This archaic law was put in place due to pervasive xenophobia in the US regarding Chinese immigration in the late 19th century. As James Bradley puts it, quote, "A mirage about distant and cuddly, noble Chinese peasants was all the rage, but Americans still wouldn't risk a Chinese person living next door." End quote. The act would eventually be repealed in 1943, but nonetheless, representative of his true power, Soong was able to secure his entry into the US in 1940, 3 years before his fellow countrymen could legally. There, he got to work assembling the contours of the modern China lobby, the KMT's foreign backers in Washington, D.C. Shortly after arriving in Washington, D.C., Soong reconnected with an old friend from the United States, a man who had done more for the KMT cause than maybe any other American at the time, and that man was Henry Luce. Henry Luce was the founder of the Time Life media empire, which also eventually included the magazines Fortune and Sports Illustrated by the time of his death in 1968. Luce was born in Shanghai at the turn of the century, the son of an American reverend, working as a missionary in China. From a young age, as his biographer noted, quote, "The Christianization of China was the supreme effort of Luce's life," end quote. At 14, Luce moved to the United States, and in 1916, he enrolled at Yale University, where he was a member of the infamous secret society Skull and Bones. I mention Skull and Bones here to 1. Make the point that Luce was already at this young age a certified member of the American ruling class, but also 2. That Skull and Bones traces its history back to the Chinese opium trade, as its founder and first benefactor, William H. Russell, scion of the prestigious Russell family, had made their fortune in the opium trade. The eponymous Russell Trust would serve as the business entity behind the Skull and Bones Society, and would fund the construction of the ominous tomb that allegedly still holds some of their meetings to this day. As one of the most blatant symbols of US decadence and bourgeois interests, the Skull and Bones Society's institutional history as a byproduct of American opium profiteering is emblematic of how ingrained narco-smuggling was within the circles of the US power elite. Therefore, when during the Cold War the opium trade was once again taken up by related institutions in Southeast Asia, nothing had really changed too much for these elite groupings. This was always how it had been. Bonesman Henry Luce would go on to found Time Inc., which would become one of the largest magazine distributors in the United States. As one of the nation's preeminent editors, Luce would use his empire to continuously propagandize in favor of the China lobby's favorite, Kuomintang. He was invited back to China and later Taiwan to write profiles and pieces on Chiang Kai-shek, TV Soong, and the rest of the KMT leadership. Chiang Kai-shek, a recent convert to Southern Methodism, represented exactly the Christianized Chinese image that Luce sought to present to American readers. An image, mind you, that was not a reality outside of certain pockets in Shanghai and other Western inhabited cities in China. In 1937, Time magazine named Chiang and his wife Sun Mei Ling as People of the Year and adorned their stately portraits to the cover of the magazine. Luce was in effect selling the China dream to an American population who knew very little of the reality in the faraway country. The dream that an Americanized China was on the horizon would be put on hold as World War II and the Japanese invasion of the Chinese mainland raged on throughout the late 1930s. By 1940, the Chinese Civil War had been temporarily put on pause, so that the opposing factions could unite to counter the existential threat presented by the invading Japanese. Until the attack at Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the United States remained officially neutral in the war. That said, the Roosevelt administration was looking for ways, even before their official entry, to support the forces of Chiang Kai-shek. Materially supporting the KMT remained difficult, however, as overt US government support of the nationalists against the Japanese would still present Washington as taking an official side in the ongoing Civil War. Don't get me wrong, it was clear that Washington unofficially supported the pro-Western forces of Chiang Kai-shek, but acting on that support was a different matter altogether. Officially supporting one side of the post-Civil War by the Roosevelt administration, in this case the KMT, would have undoubtedly caused friction and potentially re-sparked the Civil War, thus allowing the Japanese to further advance throughout China. So to arm the KMT, Uncle Sam had to use covert channels. And through these covert channels, the new post-war China lobby would crystallize. In mid-1941, President Roosevelt was made aware of a retired U.S. Air Force Lieutenant General Claire Chennault, who had been recently hired by Chiang Kai-shek as his private Air Force advisor. As it stood in 1941, the KMT had little in terms of an air force, and what they did have served little use, as their army had no trained fighter pilots. The American Chennault, stuck with an unmanned fleet of shabby planes, needed to turn to American friends for support. At this intersection, General Chennault would meet Tommy the Cork Cochrane, the man who would, in many ways, represent the center of the expanding China lobby. And also, at this intersection, the influence of the aviation industry emerged as a key stakeholder in US wars in Asia. By this point, Tommy Cochrane had been a key player in Roosevelt's New Deal brain trust, and has been called the first modern lobbyist by historians. A lawyer by trade, Tommy had worked for much of the war as a lobbyist for defense contractors, specifically for the company that would become Bechtel, one of the world's largest engineering firms today. At the time, a significant shipbuilder during World War II. Of course, Bechtel is famous today for the huge contracts they were awarded after both Gulf Wars. First to clean up the Kuwaiti oil fields in 1991, and again to rebuild infrastructure and utilities in Iraq from 2003 to 2006. At the time, however, in the early 1940s, Bechtel was headed by a man whose name may sound familiar to some of you. A man named John McCone, the future director of the CIA, who President Kennedy would select to replace Allen Dulles following the Bay of Pigs fiasco nearly 2 decades later. It goes without saying that Tommy the Cork, the consummate insider, got his clients several high-paying government contracts using his contacts in the FDR administration, and made McCone, Bechtel, and himself substantially wealthier. This type of insider politics, or as I would call it, political corruption, would mark Tommy's entire career, especially as his work intersected more and more with the burgeoning intelligence community. Corruption aside, for the purposes of our story today, Tommy the Cork first met General Claire Chennault in China under the auspices of a secret mission he had been tasked with by President Roosevelt in 1941. Cochrane was charged by the president with creating secret channels of aid to Chiang Kai-shek's forces, circumventing Congress and the regular government bureaucracy. To do this, Cochrane created the China Defense Supplies Company, a shell company that would act as a middle agent in administering the Asian Lend-Lease program. Cochrane, on paper, was simply acting as the legal counsel for the China Defense Supply Company, but in reality, he was running the whole show. In 1941, Cochrane would meet Claire Chennault, desperately in need of planes and pilots. This appeared to be a perfect opportunity for Uncle Sam to extend aid to their new secret ally in East Asia, and Chennault, a former US Air Force officer now working as a foreign agent, appeared to be the perfect sponsor. So, Tommy the Cork went back to DC and was able to convince FDR to approve the creation of the American Volunteer Group. Claire Chennault would later rename them to the name we all know them as today, the Flying Tigers, and he would even get his friend Walt Disney to design their insignia. To manage the shipment of planes and pilots to Chennault's KMT Air Force, Cochrane turned to his close friend and fellow partner at the China Defense Supplies Company, one William Pauley. Born in South Carolina and raised in Cuba, Pauley was the son of a wealthy businessman. Having a background in aviation, he had ascended to become the president of the China National Aviation Company, the Chinese branch of the one and only Pan Am, a company that would continue to be deeply connected to both Southeast Asia and the China lobby. Pauley would, through the Cochrane-founded firm, redirect over 100 Curtiss-Wright Corporation P-40 fighters in Burma, which were originally destined for the UK, to Chennault in southwestern China. These would form the first contingent of the Flying Tigers. As for pilots, Roosevelt would sign an executive order in secret allowing the Flying Tigers to recruit reserve officers from the US military. These were hired under civilian cover as, quote, flying instructors. This new air wing was then operated much like a mercenary air force, paid a competitive salary, and offered a bounty for each downed Japanese plane. To bring notoriety to the Air Force, a young reporter, one Joseph Alsop, was sent down to China in 1942 as an embedded journalist with the Flying Tigers, propagating the story of the quote-unquote volunteer airline to the US public. Joseph Alsop and his brother Stuart Alsop, who was serving at the time in the new U.S. wartime spy agency, the Office of Strategic Services, would do their part and continue to work as mouthpieces for China lobby and later CIA interests throughout their careers as esteemed journalists. The Flying Tigers mostly operated out of the China-Burma-India theater of the war. It is in this theater, in Southeast Asia and southern China, that the players involved in the Flying Tigers would intersect with the other half of the China lobby, the China Cowboys, in the newly created Office of Strategic Services. The OSS China Hands, as they would come to be known, represented a uniquely grisly and cutthroat cast of intelligence operators that would continue to pop out throughout the history of Southeast Asia. The men who served with the OSS in China would leave a lasting legacy on the successor spy agency, the CIA, as they would continue to be fundamentally involved in covert action, paramilitary work, and narcotics smuggling across the globe. The director of the OSS, William Wild Bill Donovan, had a particular fixation on Southeast Asia. He would later set up his base of operations in Thailand after the war, and would briefly serve as the US ambassador to Thailand in the 1950s. The OSS commander on the ground in Southeast Asia, leading the OSS Detachment 202, was of course a man I've talked about at length on this channel, the infamous Paul Helliwell. Helliwell and his team were tasked with supporting Chiang Kai-shek's war effort against the Japanese in the southern Chinese province of Yunnan. There he would find that the KMT, with their deep connections in the Chinese underworld, funded much of their operations using the profits from the lucrative opium trade, which was plentiful in southern China. This revelation of a separate and unaccountable funding source to be tapped into would spiral into decades of covert CIA compliance and oftentimes outright support of narcotic smuggling activities to fund their illegal or unapproved operations across the globe. It was Helliwell and his agents in China during the war that first made this critical link for US intelligence. But remember, opium profits were nothing new for these elite men. Well, at least to their families. Many of the American ancestors who created the first China lobby had made their fortunes in China smuggling opium a generation or two earlier. This embrace of narcotics profits by the OSS and later the CIA was in a sense a return to the tradition set out by the first US business interests in China. Paul Helliwell, for his part, would always be involved in Asian affairs, while also becoming a critical link between the opium fields of Southeast Asia and the mafia and organized crime worlds of Florida and the Caribbean, as we will see later in this documentary. Helliwell would continue to work out of Miami post-war, as the covert paymaster and link to the underworld for his China lobby friends and the CIA alike. The Second World War naturally brought with it a massive increase in government investments in the domestic US arms industry. Most noticeable within this new defense spending was the establishment of a rigorous aviation manufacturing sector. Air power and the concept of air superiority became a fundamental aspect of modern warfare, gaining ascendancy largely out of World War II. This new sector and the swath of industrialists who profited massively off of the new aviation industry would become a powerful block of lobbyists and special interests during the Cold War. One such industrialist was none other than Howard Hughes, the billionaire heir of his father's Hughes Tool Company. The Hughes fortune had been largely built off of the company's ownership of the patent of a unique drill bit necessary for oil extraction at the time. Jumping ahead to right before the war in 1938, Howard Hughes, at the time a famed aviator, celebrated for his airspeed records, began buying stock in the domestic airline known as Trans World Airline, later known as TWA. At around the same time, in early 1939, Hughes established the Hughes Aircraft Company in California, just in time to take advantage of lucrative government wartime contracts. Jim Hougan, in his classic book Spooks, portrayed Hughes as a fraud, in taking large amounts of Air Force and War Department cash and delivering very little in return. The Hughes Aircraft Company would work to develop increasingly expensive and impractical prototype airplanes throughout the war, culminating in the development of the now famous Hercules H-4, known better as the Spruce Goose. The 10-story tall wooden amphibian plane with 8 propellers and a wingspan of 320 feet was reported by Hughes to provide capacity for 700 ready soldiers. The H-4, funded primarily by an $18 million government grant, would only be completed in 1946, and only flown once by Hughes himself in November 1947, only achieving a height of a few feet. By the end of the project, it was estimated that the cost of the useless aircraft had ballooned to $246 million in 2023 adjusted dollars. The Spruce Goose fiasco and Howard Hughes' wartime profiteering was emblematic of the new reality in the post-war military procurement environment, especially where expensive and increasingly complex aircraft were concerned. For Hughes, the Spruce Goose episode would land him in a Senate investigation into impropriety of funding for Hughes' pipe dream projects during the war. As it turned out, Hughes had received some $60 million in Air Force contracts during the war that had not delivered a single aircraft. This was despite the fact that Hughes Aircraft Company had grown from 4 employees to 80,000 in the span of the 6-year war. This had largely been achieved through the manufacturing of other companies' planes, such as Boeing and Lockheed. Over the summer of 1947, the Senate War Investigating Committee investigated Howard Hughes, and were themselves influenced by an aviation concern, that being Pan American Airways. Leading the Senate investigation was Senator Owen Brewster, who was good friends with Juan Trippe, the founder and longtime chairman of Pan Am. According to Hughes, Pan Am was attempting to lobby the US government to place it at the head of a worldwide overseas flight monopoly. It was also suggested that Brewster was attempting to blackmail Hughes to have him merge his TWA airline with his good friend Juan Trippe's Pan Am. These allegations do hold some weight when we consider that TWA was beginning to expand into international overseas markets at the time, a market that had been dominated solely by Pan Am beforehand. Also, Pan Am would eventually be granted the monopoly on overseas flights to Southeast Asia during the entire Second Indochina War, and according to Peter Dale Scott, this undoubtedly contributed to their tremendous growth over the 1960s and 70s. But regardless of the truth of Hughes' allegations, in the end, despite its questionable practical use, Howard was able to prove that the Spruce Goose could fly in November of that same year, and handed over the aircraft to the Air Force. This largely dispelled Brewster's investigation, although the questions of wartime profiteering were still very much present. Nonetheless, both Hughes' TWA and Juan Trippe's Pan Am would go on to become 2 of the largest commercial airlines in the Cold War, both ushering in the jet age in the mid-1960s. Pan Am's founder, Trippe, would see the success of his good friend Bill Allen, longtime chairman of Boeing. TWA, followed by Pan Am, would be the first companies to deploy the Boeing 707, one of the first jet-powered commercial airliners, in the 1960s. These 2 firms would help Boeing to become one of the largest domestic consumer and military aircraft manufacturers, and to this day, it still is, one of the truly transcendent and untouchable companies in the US, as they continue to slay whistleblowers with impunity. As for Hughes Aircraft Company, it too would become massively profitable starting in the 1950s, as the company would pioneer the manufacture of helicopters under its subsidiary Hughes Helicopters, to eventually bring massive profits to Hughes in the 1960s throughout the Vietnam War. Hughes Aircraft also saw the development of the first air-to-air guided missile known as the AIM-4F Super Falcon in 1955, marking a long history as a missile manufacturer and developer. The Howard Hughes and Pan Am rivalry was indicative of the underlying military-industrial complex interests that were already beginning to seep their way into the American political process as early as 1947. Throughout our presentation, we will continue to see both TWA and Pan Am interests intersect and intervene as both crown jewels of the post-war aerospace industry solidly embedded themselves into the underbelly of the US establishment, and continue to rub shoulders with intelligence agents and spooks across the Cold War American landscape. It also goes without saying that Pan Am, TWA, Boeing, and Hughes Aircraft would all benefit massively from the Vietnam War some 2 decades later, as some of the main providers of military aircraft and air services within the new theater of the war in Southeast Asia. Around the same time, in 1946, following the end of the Second World War, General Claire Chennault and his Flying Tigers also reorganized themselves into a fully privatized company to take advantage of the post-war aviation boom, under the name of Civil Air Transport, or CAT for short. Chennault founded CAT alongside another China lobby hand, a lawyer named Whiting Willower. Willower had served as the director of the Far East branch of the Foreign Economic Administration during the last years of the war, and for his part would become a key asset to the CIA in their future coups in Latin America, as we will see shortly. Alongside CAT was another spin-off of the Flying Tigers, called Flying Tiger Line, another Claire Chennault investment that sought to provide additional cargo shipping to Taiwanese interests. Later down the line, Flying Tiger Line would be partially directed by Chennault's Chinese wife, Anna Chennault, who after Claire's early death in 1958 would continue to represent his interests posthumously as a publicist for both airlines. As for CAT, it would continue to operate as an on-paper private entity, but in reality served the KMT and Chiang Kai-shek directly. Peter Dale Scott notes that early funding for civil air transport following the end of World War II and the cessation of direct U.S. aid likely came directly from Chinese millionaire and Taiwanese ambassador T.V. Soong and Chiang's wealthy wife. During this period, CAT worked to deliver relief and weapons to the quickly deteriorating KMT across China's mainland until the very last days of the war. Everything changed in 1949 when the Chinese Civil War ended with Mao's People's Liberation Army emerging victorious. This event, which would become known as the Loss of China in the United States, would become something of a mythologized moment in US history. The Truman administration, who had fully committed itself to supporting anti-communist forces in Europe, through both the overt Marshall Plan and through covert influence and paramilitary campaigns, such as in support of fascist militias during the Greek Civil War and in meddling in the Italian election in 1948, had turned their attention away from Asia and, according to the anti-communist press, had allowed China to go red. This watershed moment, the loss of China, in many ways led to the formal birth of the Cold War China lobby. With Mao's communists in charge of mainland China, the China lobby-backed Kuomintang was exiled to Taiwan. Truman, and all future presidential administrations until at least the mid-1970s, would be haunted by the prospect of having their own loss of China moment. The reaction within the United States in 1949 was overwhelming, with the rise of McCarthyism, the charges of high government treason, and a general sense of omnipresent paranoia of a communist conspiracy seeping into every level of American life. Not to mention 1949 also saw the Soviets drop their first nuclear bomb. In many senses, 1949 was the true beginning of the Cold War as it is popularly depicted. So the China lobby got to work recruiting young American politicians who could turn their rhetoric into policy. One such politician was a young Richard Nixon, who aligned himself with the China lobby during the 1950 Senate election in California. Stephen Ambrose, in his first volume on Nixon, quotes the senatorial candidate at a San Francisco speech as stating the following, quote, "While engaging in a Cold War against the spread of communism in some parts of the world, we have adopted a policy of virtual isolationism elsewhere. Communism requires a worldwide resistance." End quote. In a sense, this speech was parroting the China lobby's line on further US intervention in Asia. And of course, Nixon would go on to win his Senate seat in 1950, and of course would serve as vice president under Eisenhower for 8 years, a position where he would cement himself in the US political imagination as the archetypal Cold Warrior, and at least rhetorically, an advocate of the China lobby's favored policy of rollback. In the Democratic Party, the China lobby stooge Tommy the Cork had been hired to help an up-and-coming Texas Senate candidate and personal friend, one Lyndon Baines Johnson, win one of the 2 Texas Senate seats. A congressman at the time, Johnson sought election twice to the Senate, first in an unsuccessful bid in 1941, and later a successful attempt in 1948. Cochran was brought on in both races as a campaign manager, and through his usual influence peddling, successfully got LBJ into the Senate. LBJ would eventually become Senate Majority Leader and would be dubbed the Master of the Senate for his long and ruthlessly effective record in that position. It may be the case that his longtime political consultant, Tommy the Cork, had some influence on Johnson's backroom dealing style of politics that made him so successful and effective in the Senate. But more importantly, the China lobby had effectively elevated the political careers of the 2 men who would be maybe the most responsible for the escalations of violence in Southeast Asia: future presidents Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon. Most interestingly is how China lobby hands would continue to pop up throughout both of their lengthy political careers, as we will see. In the context of the Cold War, the China lobby's goal of aggressively pushing the communists out of China represented one half of the dichotomy of Western Cold War foreign policy. When dealing with the new foreign policy paradigm presented by the Cold War, Theorists by 1950 had determined the two major courses of action that could be taken by Washington policymakers in this new environment. The first avenue, which was favored by the internationalists in the Truman administration, was a policy of containment, which sought to encircle socialist countries by taking away their breathing room, or working to consolidate all their neighboring states into a bloc that worked as a bulwark against further expansion. NATO, for example, comes out of this line of thinking. Following the Soviet Union's acquisition of nuclear weapons, containment was solidified as the only possible course of action, as any directly aggressive policy against the Soviet Union would almost certainly engender a nuclear war and thus total annihilation. This did not stop the more hawkish foreign policy experts in Washington, D.C., and the West more broadly, to advocate for the second option for Cold War strategy, that of rollback. Rollback was first coined in April 1950, shortly after the loss of China, by the State Department's Director of Policy Planning, one Paul Nitze, in a National Security Council memo numbered NSC 68. Paul Nitze nowadays is a fairly obscure figure, but his legacy remains stronger than ever to this day. Nitze could be seen as the originator of the concept of the militarized Cold War, or in other words, the idea that the only way to defeat the Soviet Union, or to come out victorious from the Cold War, was with an overwhelming increase in US military spending, with militarism leading to either a Soviet collapse or an eventual policy of aggressive rollback against the Soviet Union. Paul Nitze could be seen in a sense as the forefather of the US as a global police force, aggressively intervening to remove unsuitable regimes and treating any advance by socialists across the globe as a monolithic and centralized threat being pushed by Moscow or Beijing. In many senses, Paul Nitz's NSC 68 laid the foundation for the establishment of the military-industrial complex as we know it today. And of course, this exact line of thinking would evolve beyond the Cold War and morph into the underlying theoretical framework of neoconservatism and eventually towards the War on Terror. It was Paul Nitz's NSC 68 in April 1950 which stated the following recommendations as seen on screen. Most important are the first three, which I want to highlight. Quote, A. To defend the Western Hemisphere and essential Allied areas in order that their war-making capabilities be developed. B. To provide and protect a mobilization base while the offensive forces required for victory are being built up. And C. To conduct offensive operations to destroy vital elements of the Soviet war-making capacity and to keep the enemy off balance until the full offensive strength of the United States and its allies can be brought to bear. End quote. Nitze recommended that this program be achieved by a, quote, substantial increase in expenditures for military purposes adequate to meet the requirements for the tasks listed in D1, and a substantial increase in military assistance programs designed to foster cooperative efforts which will adequately and effectively meet the requirements of our allies for the tasks referred above. And maybe most interestingly, the, quote, reduction of federal expenditures for purposes other than defense and foreign assistance, if necessary, by the deferment of certain desirable programs. And this was, of course, paired with, quote, increased taxes, end quote. Nitz's NSC 68 policy prescription is any hawk's wet dream. In no uncertain terms, it outlined the roadmap to a militarized state, or in other words, the introduction of perpetual peacetime military spending. This was, by the view of the hardliners, the only way to counter communist advances throughout the globe. For the Truman administration, still scarred by the loss of China and the domestic blowback from the McCarthyites and the China lobby adherents, were provided an immediate opportunity in June 1950 when North Korean troops crossed the 38th parallel into South Korea. Truman ordered US troops to support the South under a UN directive, and the Korean War had begun. In many ways, the Korean War, the first major US Army campaign of the Cold War, institutionalized the peacetime military spending that would become a mainstay within the United States economy throughout the post-war era. According to James Bradley, the first defense budget presented by Truman following the US's entry into Korea totaled $50 billion, nearly doubling the budget from the year before, representing the first substantial spending increase to the US military since 1946. You can see this clearly illustrated on the graph on screen. Once the sharp decline in post-war military spending was reversed, following the US entry into the Korean War, the defense industry had been reignited, not to be turned off ever again. What emerged was what some scholars have come to call military Keynesianism. At the time, the New Deal politicians that emerged from FDR's cabinet largely advocated for the economic theories of John Maynard Keynes. In an overly simplified sense, Keynesian economists claimed that significant government spending on infrastructure and public works projects could be used in times of recession or depression to help increase employment and temper the downturn in the economy. This is known in Keynesian terms as pumping the economy. Then, as the theory goes, once the economy is brought back to prosperity with the help of this sharp government spending, the economy is then to be primed, or in other words, government spending is reeled in and the economy is allowed to prosper until another downturn hits. With FDR's New Deal, Keynesianism was put into practice, with the deployment of wide-scale infrastructure projects during the nadir of the Great Depression. These projects were mostly civilian in nature until the US entered World War II in 1941, and much of that spending was diverted to the defense sector, and thus the US was to create an unprecedented manufacturing base dedicated not to building consumer goods, but instead weapons of war. Although weapons in and of themselves do not generate the same productive value to a society as, say, roads and schools, the spending and labor force engagement did nonetheless perpetuate the desired Keynesian pump, which led to widespread economic prosperity in the domestic United States regardless of the ongoing World War. And thus, in the post-war years, in response to the drawdown in US military spending in the newly found peace, military Keynesianism would rear its head, and the military-industrial complex was born. With the advent of the Korean War, the Truman administration began awarding large government contracts to arms manufacturers who had not seen such procurement since the end of World War II. Many of these interests, specifically in aviation, intersected with the powerful China lobby ventures. The aerospace industry, the builders of airplanes, helicopters, rockets, and eventually space shuttles, would all see a massive boom during the Cold War, as firms such as Boeing, Lockheed, and Northrop would emerge as the crown jewels of the new military-industrial complex. Air power had gained new ascendancy in the modern warfare paradigm, and the advent of rocketry, first developed by the Nazis and imported to the US through the smuggling of Operation Paperclip scientists, would open the door for theoretically infinite spending on both nuclear-armed rockets and eventually space-bound rocket ships. It is also no coincidence that the establishment of the military-industrial complex in the 1950s and 60s coincided with what many consider to be the golden era of American capitalism. These massive defense contracts led to high-paying unionized, entry-level manufacturing jobs for millions of Americans across the country. These new, comparatively high-paying jobs, paired with the GI Bill allowing recent veterans of World War II to attend higher education at a subsidized price, led to an opening of the American middle class and the emergence of the mythologized American dream. Or put otherwise, the promise of upward social mobility for the masses. Of course, that is as long as you were white. Many of the new suburbs of the 1950s remained segregated, as well as the new factory jobs and college campuses. The workers, back from the wars in Europe and the Pacific, would work in the new factories, some building refrigerators and vacuum cleaners, and many others building cluster bombs and C-130s. This was the emergence of a new social contract. The American taxpayer would fund an ever-expanding peacetime arms industry, and in return, the US public would be provided well-paying, unionized jobs within a protected domestic manufacturing industry. It is no surprise that today, in a post-NAFTA neoliberal world, that some of the only remaining manufacturing jobs in the US are in the defense industry. It remains one of the only protected domestic sectors due primarily to the security risk in offshoring. This has, however, led to a continued prominence of domestic US manufacturing, specifically in arms and weapons systems. The military-industrial complex, as it was in the 1950s, was here to stay. Now returning to 1950 and the US entry into Korea, the aviation industry, largely dormant since World War II, was given a flurry of lucrative government contracts. One of these aviation interests, which was admittedly a comparatively small one, was civil air transport, the airline reformed from the Flying Tigers in 1946. CAT had coincidentally been officially sold to the newly established Central Intelligence Agency in 1950, just before the Korean War kicked off. It was CAT executive Whiting Willower, who would, through former OSS China hand and current CIA paymaster Paul Helliwell, be introduced to Frank Wisner, the head of the Office of Policy Coordination, the Covert Operations Center of the CIA. The stagnating CAT, struggling in the post-war government contract drought, was purchased for $1 million by the CIA, with Paul Helliwell working as the broker. And just like that, the CIA had acquired an airline, which would continue to operate out of Taiwan and increasingly out of Bangkok in Thailand. Pan Am executive William Pauly, who had once helped the Flying Tigers acquire their first planes during the Chinese Civil War, would also ensure the continued supply of decommissioned Pan Am planes and off-duty Pan Am pilots to CAT, as a courtesy to his former colleagues in the CIA. Now, although the Truman administration had finally acted in Asia with the outset of the Korean War, the administration's hopes of enacting rollback were quickly tempered by the intervention of China in support of the North Koreans once the US approached the Yalu River on the China-Korea border. By late 1950, only a few months into the war, it had already become a stalemate, largely stuck back at the 38th parallel. What had originally been a war seeking rollback turned into another manifestation of containment. To the adherents of the policy of rollback, the policy of Claire Chennault, the Dulles brothers, and the China lobby, the Truman administration was still coming up short. It was through their new airline, Civil Air Transport, that the CIA was able to begin to directly push for a rollback of communism in China. Sometime in late 1950, not wasting any time, the CIA began planning Operation Paper, which contracted CAT planes to support breakaway Chinese nationalist troops under General Li Mi in Burma. CIA paymaster Paul Helliwell created the Sea Supply Company, an agency cutout firm based in Miami but operating out of Bangkok, which ferried guns and supplies from US Army depots to the KMT troops in the Burmese state of Shan. These KMT troops in the Shan state had been funding their operations through the lucrative opium trade in the region. The opium, harvested by the Shan KMT-controlled villages, was then brought to market by the Thai Border Police, a CIA-backed paramilitary force that was notoriously involved in the North-South opium trade. And no doubt, in the middle of this whole operation, providing the logistics needed to get weapons to the isolated KMT forces, and, of course, the narcotics out of their controlled poppy fields, was the CIA's very own airline, CAT. Soon, they would be shipping weapons and narcotics all across the subcontinent in the upcoming decades. Operation Paper was by most accounts where the CIA became intimately complicit in the international narcotics trade. What needs to be understood is that this new line of funding from the Southeast Asian opium fields all the way to the streets of New York City would grow in importance throughout the Cold War, as supply increased and demand in the US domestic market followed suit. Opium, and by proxy heroin, became key commodities for several stakeholders that shared a similar interest in the war conspiracy. These interests, intelligence agencies, narco-states, organized crime, traffickers, local farmers and growers in the Golden Triangle, and corrupt law enforcement, all came together to increasingly profit from the narcotics trade. In our case, Southeast Asian opium. Therefore, all these diverse groups had a vested interest in securing the gravy train, starting of course in the opium fields of Burma and Laos and southern China. In sum, the forces outlined were all allied out of convenience, all sharing the goal of keeping the communists out of Southeast Asia, but also in keeping the dope flowing, and the covert funding source intact for all the involved organizations, especially the CIA, that depended on this illicit budget to undertake many of their unapproved operations. As for Operation Paper in Burma, over the years of 1951 and 1952, Li Mi's opium smuggling forces made at least 3 cross-border raids into China to attempt to regain ground for the Taiwanese government in the south of the country. Although these attempts failed, and Operation Paper had largely ended by 1953, they did represent the first legitimate attempts in Southeast Asia at a policy of rollback. Not to mention that the KMT forces would remain in Burma throughout much of the future Vietnam War, as a CIA proxy force, ready to activate in neighboring Laos at any moment, and preserving the Shan opium fields for their CIA clients. As Harry Truman left the White House in January 1953, the CIA old boys waited patiently as, for the first time since the creation of the agency in 1947, they had a Republican president coming into the Oval Office, General Dwight Eisenhower. Finally, a sympathetic leader, ready to give the CIA free rein, and free rein they would get in the Eisenhower years. Thank you all so much for watching as always, and if you enjoyed this first part of the War Conspiracy series, please leave a like and comment down below letting me know what you thought. It helps a lot with the algorithm, and I'm always happy to read all the comments below. The video you watched today first aired to my Patreon subscribers on May 22nd, 2024. I would not have been able to dedicate the time and effort away from friends and family producing this video without their generous support. On screen now are the names of my producer tier patrons. As you know, when you watch Eyes Wide Open on YouTube, it is always ad-free. I do not make any money off of YouTube ads, which allows me to say what I want and not worry about keeping my content within the confines of YouTube's stringent monetization policy. That said, I am completely dependent on individual support to do the work that I do. So to my patrons, thank you. Next week, continuing with the War Conspiracy series, I'll be shifting over to Central America. Firstly, for a brief overview of Operation PB Success, the CIA coup in Guatemala in 1954. Well, it turns out that many of the China lobby figures we encountered in today's episode would crop back up in the Guatemalan operation as well. This also served as a perfect segue into the CIA Cuba show, which is where the focus of my documentaries will be for the rest of the season. I also want to highlight the fact that in next week's video, I cover some of my proudest research yet, that being into the obscure Rockefeller funding of CIA spy satellites. Some of the information here I'm pretty sure has never been covered anywhere else, so stay tuned for that, as this is some of the deepest research I've done into some truly obscure nooks of American intelligence. Again, I can't wait to share it with you all. But until then, if you wish to support my independent documentary filmmaking, please consider checking out my Patreon link below. The 4 remaining videos that will be premiering weekly on this channel over the rest of 2024 and the most recent series I made on George Bush are available there now if you wish to binge them. I am also nearly done writing the next few documentaries that I'm planning on presenting, closing off the Cuba show and leading up to the JFK assassination. This will include parts about the JM Wave Station in Miami, as well as the New Orleans milieu, and finally finishing off the War Conspiracy series with Lyndon Johnson and his ties to the military-industrial complex, which will hopefully lead us back into Laos into early 2025. I am looking forward to sharing these videos with my Patreon supporters shortly. They will come out within the next few months. That's all I've got for today, folks, but thank you so much for watching as always, and remember to always keep your eyes wide open. Take care.